My husband got my best friend pregnant with twins. When he threw the divorce papers on my kitchen island, demanding our home and his business, I did not cry or beg. I quietly signed on the dotted line and let him walk out the door. He thought he had won. He had no idea that when he showed those papers to his mother, she would turn completely pale and ask him the one question he never saw coming. She still has not told you about the debt. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how my ex-husband signed away his entire life without even reading the fine print. My name is Maya. I am 34 years old and I work as a wealth manager for high net worth clients in Atlanta. My entire career is built on assessing risk, managing assets, and predicting outcomes. But I never predicted the massive betrayal that walked through my front door last Monday. The heavy manila envelope hit my custom granite kitchen island with a loud, aggressive slap. I looked up from my laptop to see Terrence, my husband of 6 years, standing across from me. His chest was puffed out like a rooster. He did not look guilty. He did not look ashamed. He looked incredibly proud. "I am leaving you, Maya," he announced. His voice echoed in the high ceilings of the house I had purchased with my own money. "Keisha is pregnant. We are having twins." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Keisha, my best friend. We had shared a dorm room at Spelman College 12 years ago. We had shared secrets, wardrobes, and countless late-night conversations about our futures. She was the one who stood right beside me as my maid of honor when I married Terrence. And now she was carrying his children. Terrence planted his hands firmly on the granite countertop, leaning forward to deliver the rest of his demands. He braced himself for the screaming, the throwing of plates, the desperate weeping pleas for him to stay. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to fall apart to validate his decision. I simply closed my laptop, folded my hands together, and looked at the envelope. "I want a divorce," he continued, his tone growing louder, emboldened by my silence. "The papers are all right there. I am keeping the consulting firm, obviously. And I want the house. It is the best place to raise my children. You can keep your little investments and your client portfolios." He sneered at me, his eyes full of contempt. "You are a cold, barren spreadsheet calculator, Maya. You care more about profit margins and quarterly reviews than giving me a legacy. Keisha is a real woman. She is warm. She is giving me a family. You could never do that." The sting of his words was meant to paralyze me. Using my struggles with fertility as a weapon was the lowest blow he could deliver. For a split second, the air left my lungs. But then the absolute discipline I had cultivated in the financial sector kicked in. The grief was pushed down instantly, replaced by a sharp, crystalline clarity. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into my tailored blazer pocket and pulled out my Mont Blanc pen. I uncapped it with a soft, deliberate click. "A legacy, Terrence," I said. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it was as steady and cold as stone. "That is a beautiful word for a man wearing a $5,000 suit, paid for by the very spreadsheet calculator he is currently insulting." His jaw tightened, a flash of insecurity crossing his face, but I did not let him interrupt. "Do you remember the basement apartment on Elm Street?" I asked, tracing the smooth black barrel of my pen. "The one where you were eating instant noodles for dinner every night. You were dodging calls from collection agencies because your student loans were drowning you. I built your credit score from scratch. I funded the lease for that consulting firm you are so proud of. I am the reason you have a starting line at all. So please spare me the arrogant speech about your legacy." Terrence scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest to shield himself from the truth. "You can try to fight me in court, Maya, but I will drag this out for years. Keisha needs a stable home before the babies arrive, and I am not leaving without what is rightfully mine." He expected a bitter war over the assets. He wanted me to fight tooth and nail, giving him the opportunity to paint me as the vindictive, bitter ex-wife to his family and friends. Instead, I pulled the thick stack of legal documents from the manila envelope. I did not bother reading the first 40 pages. I knew exactly what his cheap lawyer had drafted. I flipped straight past the asset division, past the property claims, directly to the final signature page. "What are you doing?" Terrence asked. His smug expression faltered quickly, shifting into genuine confusion. I pressed the gold nib of my pen to the heavy paper and signed my name in fluid, precise strokes. I signed away the house. I signed away any claim to his precious consulting firm. I signed it exactly as he had drafted it, without a single revision or argument. I slid the thick packet of papers back across the granite island toward him. I am giving you exactly what you asked for, Terence. Congratulations on your new family. He stared at the signed documents, utterly unnerved by my eerie calmness. This was entirely too easy. His fragile ego could not process a complete victory without a struggle. He had prepared for a battle, and I had simply handed him the keys to the castle. But his greed quickly overtook his confusion. He snatched the papers off the counter, a triumphant, arrogant smirk returning to his face. "You always were too clinical for your own good," he sneered, shaking his head. "Have a nice life, Maya." He grabbed his designer duffel bags from the hallway and walked out the front door, eager to rush back to Keisha and celebrate his massive victory. I stood perfectly still and listened to the heavy oak door click shut. The profound silence of the large house settled around me. I walked over to the crystal decanter on the side table and poured myself a generous measure of neat bourbon. I took a slow sip, letting the burning warmth spread through my chest and steady my nerves. Then I picked up my phone and dialed my attorney. Julian answered on the second ring. "Tell me he did not actually hand them to you," he said, his deep voice crackling over the line. "He slapped them right on the kitchen island," I replied, staring at the empty space where the envelope had been just moments ago. "And you did not react?" Julian asked. "Not a single tear," I confirmed. "I signed them on the spot." I could hear the predatory grin in Julian's voice. So he really did it. He signed his own draft without reviewing the secondary clauses we embedded during the initial business formation. He was too busy bragging about his new legacy to read Appendix B, one said, taking another sip of bourbon. What Terence did not know, what he was too lazy to ever research, was that I never just supported his consulting firm out of the goodness of my heart. As a wealth manager, I protect my investments. I had funded his entire business through a dummy corporation, an LLC, that I had complete sole ownership of. I was not his ex-wife walking away empty-handed. I was his sole creditor, and nestled deep within his original operating agreement was a strict morality and infidelity clause that he had just legally affirmed by citing his new children in the divorce filing. "Execute the asset seizure," Julian Y instructed, my voice echoing in the empty kitchen. "But hold off on serving him for exactly 48 hours. "Why the delay?" Julian asked. "Because Keisha is being induced tomorrow," I replied. "Let them think they have won. Let them celebrate their little victory. I have a hospital visit to make." Terence thought he had just walked away with my house and a thriving business. He had no idea he had just signed his own financial death warrant. The heavy oak door was still vibrating in its frame from the force of his exit. I stood alone in the center of my kitchen, holding the divorce settlement. The ink from my signature was barely dry. I traced my finger over the crisp, black lines, feeling the deep impression my pen had left on the thick paper. Terence walked out of here believing he had conquered me. He thought his booming voice and his cruel words about my fertility had broken my spirit. He assumed my silence was submission. He assumed wrong. I picked up my phone and dialed Julian. My attorney answered before the second ring. His voice came through the speaker sharp and alert. "Tell me he actually put pen to paper," Julian said. "He did not just sign it," I replied. Staring down at the document, he practically carved his name into the page. He was in such a rush to leave me with nothing that he completely skipped over the annexes. I could hear the slow, deliberate breath Julian took on the other end of the line, the quiet sound of professional admiration. "You are telling me he did not read Appendix B?" "He did not read a single word of it," I confirmed. "He saw the clause where I formally waived my spousal right to half the value of his consulting firm. He saw that I was surrendering my claim to the primary residence. His ego took over. He genuinely believes he outsmarted a wealth manager who handles 9-figure portfolios for a living." Julian let out a dark, booming laugh. "The arrogance of mediocre men will never cease to amaze me," He just surrendered his entire life because he was too cheap and too proud to hire independent counsel to review a custom-drafted settlement. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the meticulously landscaped backyard. 5 years ago, Terrence was sitting on a stained futon in a basement apartment. He was drowning in student loan debt, and his credit score was a complete disaster. He came to me with a poorly formatted business plan for a consulting firm begging me to co-sign a massive business loan. I refused to co-sign. I knew his financial habits were chaotic. Instead, I quietly hired Julian to establish a blind trust and a dummy corporation called Apex Holdings. Terrence spent months pitching his business to banks and getting rejected. Then, miraculously, an anonymous angel investment firm offered him the exact capital he needed to launch. I will never forget the day he ran into our apartment lifting me off the ground, bragging about how a group of elite investors saw his genius. He spent the next 5 years walking around Atlanta like a self-made titan. He loved telling his friends and his family that he built his empire from the ground up without a dime of his wife's corporate money. He had no idea that I was Apex Holdings. I was the angel investor. I funded his office space, his payroll, and the very suit he wore to walk out on me today. I was not his supportive wife standing in the shadows. I was his sole creditor. Let us review the parameters of his newly signed disaster, Julian said, the rustle of papers echoing through the phone. By signing this specific uncontested divorce settlement, Terrence legally verified all outstanding debts and liens against his business entity. He acknowledged that Apex Holdings holds the primary lien on all his corporate assets. But the real masterpiece is the morality trigger. The infidelity clause, I said, taking a sip of the bourbon I had poured earlier. The liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, a warm contrast to the ice running through my veins. Exactly, Julian replied. The original funding contract stipulated that any moral turpitude specifically defined as infidelity, resulting in a child born out of wedlock, triggers an immediate call on the entire principal of the loan, compound interest included. By putting in writing that he is leaving the marriage because Keisha is pregnant with his twins, he just officially confessed to the triggering event. The debt is due, every single penny. How much exactly does he owe Apex Holdings as of this morning, I asked, walking my fingers across the cold granite countertop. $2.5 million, Julian stated smoothly. Payable immediately. And since he used his consulting firm as collateral, when he inevitably defaults on this massive sum, all of his corporate assets, his client lists, his intellectual property, and his business accounts automatically revert to you. You own him, Maya. You own his past, his present, and his entire future. My mind drifted to Keisha. Keisha, who sat at my dining table just last week, drinking my expensive wine and complaining about how hard it was to find a good black man in this city. Keisha, who hugged me when I cried about my failed fertility treatments. We shared a dorm room at Spelman. We navigated our 20s together. She was supposed to be my sister. Instead, she was quietly carrying my husband's children, plotting to move into my house and take over my life. She wanted my husband, my status, and my perceived security. She thought she had successfully stolen the finished product. She thought Terrence was a wealthy, successful entrepreneur who could provide her with a lavish lifestyle. She had no idea that the man she slept with was nothing more than a hollow shell funded by my bank accounts. She wanted my life. I was going to let her have it, debt and all. Give me the green light, Maya, Julian said, breaking through my thoughts. I can file the paperwork within the hour. We can freeze his business accounts before he even finishes unpacking his bags at his new place. We can serve the default notices to his office by tomorrow morning. He will be locked out of his own company before lunch. I looked at the digital clock on my oven. I thought about Terrence rushing across town to be with Keisha. I thought about the triumphant smiles on their faces, the false sense of victory they were currently drowning in. Freezing his accounts now would be satisfying, but it would lack the theatrical precision they truly deserved. They needed to feel untouchable first. The fall is always harder when you believe you have reached the summit. Hold off, I told Julian. Do not file a single piece of paper yet. Julian paused. Maya, you have the kill shot. Why are we waiting? Because Keisha is scheduled to be induced tomorrow morning, I explained, walking toward the grand staircase. Terrence is going to invite his entire family to the hospital to celebrate his new legacy. He wants Vivian and Roland to see the children I could not give him. He wants to parade Keisha around as his perfect new prize. I want them to experience the absolute peak of their delusion. You want an audience? Julian noted, his voice lowering with understanding. I do not just want an audience, I replied. I want them to feel completely secure. I want Terrence to look at those babies and think his future is set in stone. I want Keisha to settle into the luxury condo she thinks Terrence rented for her. I want them to breathe easy for exactly 48 hours. Keep the asset seizure ready. Have the eviction notices drafted. I will give you the signal when the time is right. Eviction notices plural? Julian asked. Yes, I said, reaching the top of the stairs and looking down at the foyer. Terrence told Keisha he secured a luxury condo for her in Midtown. He used his company account to lease it. But the building is managed by Vanguard Realty. Vanguard is a subsidiary of my property management group. I technically own her lease. Draft a 24-hour eviction notice for the condo. Julian let out a sharp whistle. You are not just taking the business. You are putting them on the street. I am putting them exactly where they belong, I corrected. Draft the documents. Have the courier standing by. I have a hospital visit to make. I hung up the phone and walked into my master bedroom. The space felt remarkably clean now that Terrence had removed his belongings. The scent of his cheap cologne was already fading from the air. I walked into my massive walk-in closet and began scanning my wardrobe. If I was going to crash the celebration of my husband's new family, I needed to look like a woman who had not lost a single thing. I selected a tailored crimson suit, sharp, powerful, commanding. I laid it out meticulously. I was not a victim. I was a wealth manager executing a hostile takeover of my own life. Terrence and Keisha wanted to play a game of deception and theft. They thought they had rewritten the rules of my marriage. They failed to realize that I owned the board, I owned the pieces, and I was about to flip the entire table. It took exactly 48 hours for the trap to spring. I spent those 2 days operating with the kind of ruthless precision that built my career. I did not stay in bed crying over my failed marriage. I went to my office, finalized a corporate merger for a client, and drank black coffee while Julian orchestrated the quiet, systemic dismantling of my husband's financial existence. The grief tried to claw its way up my throat, but I pushed it down, burying it under a mountain of legal statutes and asset forfeiture protocols. Terrence and Keisha were out there celebrating their grand victory, believing they had successfully stolen my life. They had no idea I was simply letting them enjoy their last meal. When Friday morning arrived, I bypassed the casual, comfortable clothing one might expect a person to wear to a maternity ward. Instead, I dressed for a corporate execution. I wore a pristine, tailored white crepe suit that cost more than Terrence made in his entire first year of business. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless bun, and my heels clicked with sharp, measured authority against the pavement. I walked into the sweeping glass lobby of Atlanta General Hospital, holding a perfectly wrapped silver box finished with a thick satin ribbon. I did not look like a discarded, grieving ex-wife. I looked like the owner of the building arriving to collect a debt. I bypassed the crowded front desk and took the private access elevator straight to the VIP maternity wing. Terrence had always loved spending money he did not actually possess, and this suite was no exception. I could hear the loud, festive celebration before I even reached the door of room 412. The space was vibrating with boisterous laughter and the popping of a sparkling cider bottle. I did not knock. I simply pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside the expansive suite. The room was packed to the brim with Terrence's relatives treating the hospital room like a private country club. Terrence was standing by the large bay window, proudly holding one of the newborns in a blue blanket. His mother Vivian was hovering over the second plastic bassinet, cooing loudly. Roland, his father, was pouring the cider into plastic champagne flutes. The moment I crossed the threshold, the laughter died instantly. The silence that swept through the suite was so absolute and heavy that you could clearly hear the low hum of the medical monitors. Terrence froze completely, the smile sliding off his face as if he had seen a ghost. Roland slowly lowered the bottle. Vivian clutched the edge of the bassinet, her eyes darting toward me as if I had come to steal the children. Keisha was propped up against a mountain of pillows in the center of the room. She looked exhausted from the delivery, but overwhelmingly triumphant. When she saw me standing there in my immaculate white suit, her initial shock morphed rapidly into a venomous, satisfied smirk. She shifted against the pillows and adjusted her expensive silk robe, making absolutely sure everyone in the room was watching her. She wanted to play the gracious victor. She let out a harsh, mocking laugh and told me I had a lot of nerve showing up to her delivery room. She looked at Terrence, then back at me, her voice dripping with artificial, sickening pity. Keisha told the entire room that she understood why I was so bitter and desperate. She actually had the audacity to place her hand over her chest, proclaiming loudly that Terrence finally had a real black woman by his side, a woman who could actually give him a true bloodline and a legacy. She sneered that my cold corporate body was barren, and that no amount of money could buy the family she had just provided for my husband. Vivian nodded in enthusiastic agreement from the corner, whispering loudly enough for me to hear that the Lord always provides for those who follow the natural traditional path, and that Terrence was finally free of my stiff, controlling grip. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or break my posture. I walked slowly to the edge of her hospital bed, the sharp clicking of my heels cutting through the dense silence of the room. I looked down at the woman who used to cry on my shoulder in our cramped Spelman College dorm room when she failed her midterms. I placed the beautifully wrapped silver box gently onto her lap. I smiled warmly, a genuine, terrifying smile. I told her I could not possibly miss this monumental milestone. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting it carry to the back of the room as I reminded her that she always did have a desperate taste for my leftovers. I brought up our senior year, recounting in vivid detail the time she broke into my laptop and copied my final thesis on economic disparity just so she could manage to graduate on time. I told her I let her have that stolen victory back then because I deeply pitied her complete lack of original thought and ambition. I looked directly at Terrence, whose face was turning a violent shade of red, and added that clearly her pathetic appetite for my discarded projects had not changed one bit. Terrence stepped forward, his voice booming as he demanded I leave his family alone and get out of the hospital. But Keisha was already pulling the satin ribbon off the box. Her greedy fingers tore through the silver wrapping paper, clearly expecting a desperate peace offering. She probably thought it was an expensive piece of jewelry or a lavish baby gift meant to buy her silence and protect my public reputation. She lifted the lid of the box, and her smug, victorious smile vanished entirely. Inside was not a cashmere blanket or a silver rattle. It was a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy cream paper. Keisha looked deeply confused, pulling the papers out and reading the bold capitalized print at the very top of the page. She looked up at me, her eyes darting frantically. I maintained my calm, pleasant demeanor as I explained the situation to the entire room. I told Keisha I had heard all about the beautiful, sprawling luxury condo Terrence had supposedly leased for her in Midtown to recover in with the twins. I congratulated Terrence on choosing the Vanguard building, noting that the floor-to-ceiling windows and the concierge service were truly top-tier amenities. But then I took a step closer to the bed and informed Keisha that Vanguard Realty was a direct subsidiary of my primary property management group. I told her I technically owned the entire building, and therefore I owned the very lease Terrence had signed earlier that week. Terrence crossed his arms and scoffed, telling me I could not legally break a signed lease just because I was a jealous, bitter ex-wife. I turned to my husband and informed him that I did not break the lease out of jealousy. I broke the lease because his initial deposit check had bounced. I explained that Julian had officially frozen all of his corporate and personal bank accounts at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, citing the defaulted loan to Apex Holdings. He was entirely broke. He had zero active funds, which meant the lease on the luxury condo was instantly null and void. Keisha stared at the thick cream paper in her hands, her fingers beginning to visibly tremble as she read the legal text. I looked her dead in the eye, watching the reality of her situation crash down upon her. I told her the document in her hands was a formal 24-hour eviction notice, legally binding and effective immediately. I suggested she start packing those cheap overnight bags right now because her glorious new family was about to be completely homeless by tomorrow morning. Terrence erupts into a primal roar the moment the words leave my mouth. His voice shatters the sterile hospital air echoing off the pastel walls of the maternity suite. He lunges forward, pointing a trembling finger inches from my face, calling me a bitter, jealous monster. He screams that I am a vindictive sociopath, that I am threatening to throw innocent newborn babies out onto the street simply because my own womb is useless and empty. He shouts that I am a pathetic excuse for a wife trying to punish him for finding a real woman who can build a family. Keisha is wailing dramatically behind him from the hospital bed. She clutches the heavy cream eviction notice like it is a physical weapon, burning her skin, sobbing loudly that I am ruining the most beautiful day of her life. Vivian is shrieking in the corner, clutching her pearls and threatening to call hospital security, shouting that I am a demon sent to test their faith. Roland is barking empty, blustering threats about hiring the best lawyers in Atlanta to sue me for everything I am worth. I let the symphony of their panic and delusion wash over me. It is exactly the reaction I anticipated. I do not raise my voice. I do not defend myself. I slowly raise my left arm, pulling back the cuff of my crimson blazer, and glance at the face of my platinum Cartier watch. I inform them, my voice cutting through their screaming like a scalpel, that they have exactly 23 hours and 45 minutes to vacate the luxury condominium before the local sheriff arrives to forcibly remove their belongings and lock the doors. I tell them to enjoy the street turn on my heel and walk out of the room without a single backward glance. I step out of the suite, the heavy wooden door swinging shut behind me. The thick barrier instantly muffles the chaotic, desperate screaming inside. I take a deep breath of the sterile, antiseptic hospital air, preparing to walk to the elevators and head back to my office. But before I can even take a full step down the corridor, a hand clamps down hard on my wrist. The grip is tight, frantic, and desperate. I am pulled sharply around the corner and shoved into a deserted, dimly lit adjoining hallway where the supply carts are stored. I instinctively square my shoulders, ready to defend myself, but I stop dead when I look down to see who grabbed me. It is Sarah. Sarah is married to Malik, Terrence's older golden boy brother. For years I have watched Sarah sit silently at Vivian's sprawling dining room table during Sunday dinners. She is a deeply wealthy woman from a prominent old-money New England family. Her trust fund could buy and sell Roland's failing real estate business 10 times over. But in Vivian's house, Sarah is treated like a servant. She is just the timid white outsider who never seasons her food correctly, who speaks too softly, and who does not understand their cultural dynamics. Vivian bullies her relentlessly, mocking her clothes and her quiet demeanor, and Malik never once defends his wife. Sarah usually shrinks into her expensive designer cardigans, stares at her plate, and takes the abuse with a tight, apologetic smile. But the woman standing in front of me right now, in this isolated hospital corridor, is not shrinking. She is not apologizing. She is vibrating with an intensity that borders on feral. Her knuckles are stark white. Her usually perfect sleek blonde bob is messy and disheveled. Her chest is heaving as she gasps for air, and her eyes are wide and bloodshot. She looks like a woman who has just survived a car crash. She is clutching a crumpled piece of paper tightly against her chest, pressing it over her heart like a shield. I ask her what is going on, keeping my voice low and steady to ground her panic. She looks over her shoulder, her eyes darting frantically toward the main hallway, terrified that someone from the family might hear us. She steps closer, invading my personal space, and leans in. Her voice is a frantic, breathless whisper that cracks with raw emotion. She tells me she knew something was deeply wrong the very moment Keisha announced her pregnancy due date to the family months ago. Sarah explains that Vivian forces her to manage the master family calendar, tracking everyone's flights, business trips, and social obligations. The timeline Keisha gave for the conception simply did not align with reality. Keisha claimed the babies were conceived during a specific week in October. But Sarah knew for a fact that Terrence was on a continuous mandatory consulting tour in Chicago during that exact window. Terrence had not even been in the state of Georgia. Sarah says she kept her mouth shut because no one in the family ever listens to her anyway. They would have just called her crazy or accused her of trying to stir up unnecessary drama. But when Keisha went into labor yesterday, Sarah noticed something else, something much worse. She tells me to look at Malik, her husband. She whispers that Malik has been a nervous, sweating wreck all week. He has been pacing the floors of their house, checking his phone constantly in the middle of the night, and making bizarre excuses to leave the room whenever Keisha's name was brought up. Sarah says she finally reached her breaking point. She decided to stop being the quiet, naive, obedient wife who looked the other way while her husband lied to her face. Sarah tells me she left the hospital waiting room, walked to the nearest bank, and withdrew $2,000 in crisp cash. She came back and found a night shift maternity ward nurse who looked exhausted and underpaid. Sarah pulled the nurse into a supply closet, handed her the stack of cash, and paid her under the table to expedite a highly specific, comprehensive cord blood panel on the twins the absolute second they were delivered. Sarah shoves the crumpled piece of paper into my chest, hitting my sternum. Her hands are shaking so violently I have to steady her wrists just to take the paper from her. "You need to see this, Maya," she whispers, her voice breaking completely, tears of pure, unadulterated rage spilling over her eyelashes. "Read it. Please, just read it." I unfold the crinkled paper. It is an official, preliminary neonatal laboratory report printed directly from the hospital's internal secure network. My eyes quickly scan past the standard medical jargon, ignoring the birth weights, the APGAR scores, and the basic vital signs. I drop straight down to the genetic markers and the blood typing sections. I read the lines once, then I read them again to make sure my eyes are not deceiving me. My corporate analytical training kicks in, processing the raw data, identifying the impossible glaring variables printed in black and white. Twin A and Twin B have completely incompatible blood types to share a single father. The genetic sequencing indicates a rare, almost impossible biological anomaly. They are fraternal twins, but the biological markers definitively prove that they do not share the same paternal DNA. I look up at Sarah. Her blue eyes are swimming in tears of absolute fury and devastating, soul-crushing betrayal. She nods slowly, confirming exactly what the printed paper is screaming at me. Keisha was not just sleeping with my husband, Terrence. She was sleeping with Sarah's husband, Malik. And she managed to get pregnant by both brothers during the exact same ovulation cycle. The math makes perfect, horrifying sense now. Keisha wanted to secure a permanent bag. She wanted guaranteed access to the family wealth. So she cast a wide net, hedging her bets by sleeping with both the struggling consultant and the wealthy established older brother. The sheer poetic perfection of the destruction that has just been handed to me is intoxicating. I look back down at the undeniable scientific proof in my hands, and a cold, genuine smile spreads slowly across my face. Terrence thought he was humiliating me in front of his parents. Keisha thought she had completely stolen my life and secured her future. They have absolutely no idea that they have just handed me the gasoline and the match required to burn their entire twisted family tree straight to the ground. I carefully fold the laboratory report, smoothing out the creases, and slide the paper securely into the inside pocket of my crimson blazer. I reach out and gently smooth the wrinkled collar of Sarah's expensive cashmere cardigan. I look into the eyes of a woman who has finally stopped shrinking. "Get dressed, Sarah," I tell her, my voice ringing with quiet, absolute certainty. "We are going to Sunday dinner." The heavy oak front doors of Vivian and Roland's sprawling ancestral estate were unlocked, a testament to their arrogant assumption that nothing could ever disturb their perfect Sunday bubble. I pushed them open and stepped into the grand foyer. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic rosemary, and the rich, buttery yeast rolls Vivian spent all day making to project the image of a flawless Southern matriarch. From the formal dining room, the sound of clinking crystal and boisterous laughter echoed down the hallway. They were celebrating. Terence had gathered every aunt, uncle, and cousin who mattered to welcome his new legacy. I walked into the dining room without making a sound. The mahogany table stretched out endlessly, laden with expensive silver and fine china. Terence sat near the head of the table, looking incredibly pleased with himself, while Keisha sat beside him, projecting the image of a weary but glowing new mother. She had clearly hidden the reality of her impending eviction from the rest of the room, playing the role of the conquering queen. Sarah sat quietly at the far end, next to Malik, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes locking onto mine the second I entered. She gave a microscopic nod. We were ready. The laughter died a sudden, painful death the moment the first aunt noticed me standing in the archway. Forks were lowered, wine glasses paused halfway to open mouths. The entire room turned to stare at the uninvited ghost of Terence's past. Vivian was the first to break the silence. She stood up from the head of the table, her silk blouse shimmering in the light of the antique chandelier. She did not look embarrassed by my presence. She looked thrilled to finally have the audience she always wanted to put me in my place. "What are you doing in my home?" "Maya?" Vivian asked, her voice carrying that sharp, condescending drawl she reserved exclusively for people she viewed as the hired help. "We are having a private family celebration. A celebration of new life. You have no business being here." I stepped further into the room, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. "I am simply here to deliver a few final documents to your son," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite and completely detached. Vivian let out a short theatrical laugh, looking around at her siblings and in-laws to ensure they were catching every word. "Documents," she repeated, shaking her head in mock pity. "Of course. That is all you have ever been to this family, Maya. A stack of documents. A walking spreadsheet. You walk into a house full of love and warmth, and all you can talk about is paperwork." She stepped out from behind her chair, gesturing toward Keisha, who was sitting up straighter, soaking in the matriarchal approval. "Look at Keisha." Vivian commanded the room. "She is a true blessing to this family. She understands what it means to be a woman, to nurture, to build a home. You were always entirely too corporate, Maya. Too stiff. You cared more about your tailored suits and your client portfolios than you ever cared about giving my son a traditional family. You lack the natural warmth required to be a mother, and frankly, we are all relieved that Terence finally woke up and found a real black woman to carry on our name." The aunts and uncles exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared contradict Vivian. She ruled the family with an iron fist and a fat checkbook, or so they thought. I walked slowly toward the side table, where the open bottles of wine were displayed. I picked up a crystal glass and poured myself a generous splash of a very expensive Cabernet. I took a slow sip, letting the rich vintage coat my tongue, and then tilted my head back to admire the intricate hand-carved crown molding that lined the ceiling of their grand dining room. "This really is a beautiful estate, Vivian," I said, my voice cutting through the thick tension in the room. "The craftsmanship is exquisite. It takes a lot of capital to maintain an ancestral home like this." Vivian narrowed her eyes, confused by my pivot. "It takes a strong family foundation," she corrected sharply. "Something you know nothing about." I turned my gaze away from the ceiling and locked eyes with Roland. Terence's father was sitting perfectly still, his knuckles turning white, as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. A thin sheen of sweat had suddenly broken out across his forehead. "A strong foundation," I repeated, taking another sip of wine. "That is fascinating, because I distinctly remember a very different kind of foundation back in the winter of 2019. Roland swallowed hard, his eyes silently pleading with me, but I did not stop. "You remember 2019, do you not, Roland?" I asked, taking a step toward his side of the table. "The year your commercial real estate investments completely tanked. The year you over-leveraged this beautiful ancestral home to cover your massive corporate losses. The bank was exactly 4 days away from serving you with a final notice of foreclosure." Vivian was busy hosting charity galas, completely oblivious to the fact that she was about to be packing her bags in boxes. Vivian turned sharply to her husband. "Roland, what is she talking about?" Roland could not speak. He just stared at his plate, the illusion of his patriarchal success crumbling in real time. I will tell you what I'm talking about, Vivian. I continued, my voice smooth and relentless. Your husband came to my office in the middle of the night, weeping like a terrified child. He begged me to fix his ledgers behind your back. He begged me to restructure his debt so you would never find out he had squandered the family fortune. And because I was trying to be the supportive corporate daughter-in-law you despise so much, I did it. I pulled strings. I called in favors. I reorganized his entire financial life and saved the very roof over your head. So before you stand there and lecture me about the warmth of your family, you might want to thank the cold, stiff spreadsheet calculator who kept you off the street. The dining room descended into a stunned, breathless silence. Vivian stared at Roland in absolute horror, her mouth opening and closing, as she tried to process the fact that her entire reality was a carefully managed lie. Terrence could not handle it. The sight of his parents being dismantled in front of the extended family was too much for his fragile ego. He pushed his chair back violently, the wood scraping loudly against the floor, and marched toward me. "Shut your mouth!" Maya, Terrence shouted, his chest heaving with desperate anger. "You do not get to walk in here and insult my parents. You are just lashing out because I left you. You signed the divorce papers. You signed away everything. I won. Now give me the final deed to my consulting firm so I never have to look at your face again." He held his hand out, palm up, demanding the document like a spoiled child expecting his allowance. He felt so incredibly secure in his little victory. He truly believed that his signature on that divorce decree was his ultimate shield. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the crisp, legally binding deed, transferring the ownership of Apex Holdings and its subsidiary consulting firm. Terrence smiled, a triumphant, arrogant gleam in his eye, and snatched the paper from my hand. He held it up for his family to see, ready to claim his final triumph over me. "Enjoy the firm, Terrence," I said quietly. He sneered at me, already turning away to walk back to Keisha. But before he could take a single step, I spoke again, my voice dripping with cold, calculated precision. "But before you pop the champagne to celebrate your independence, I suggested you might want to look at the fine print at the very bottom of the page, right below your signature." Terrence stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly lowered the paper and squinted at the final paragraph. I watched the blood completely drain from his face as his eyes scanned the tiny, legally binding text. The heavy cream paper trembled violently in Terrence's hands. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant, triumphant smirk that had plastered his face just seconds prior completely melted away, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, darting back and forth as if searching my face for a punchline to a sick joke. There was no joke. There was only the airtight legal trap I had meticulously built around him over the last 5 years. "Read it out loud, Terrence," I instructed, my voice slicing through the suffocating silence of the dining room. "Read the clause you so eagerly ignored when you signed our uncontested divorce settlement yesterday morning. Read the part where you willingly surrendered your entire life to me." Terrence swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He simply dropped the paper onto the mahogany table as if it had physically burned his fingers. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the side of Keisha's chair. "Since my ex-husband has suddenly lost his ability to speak, I will gladly break down the legalese for everyone in the room," I said, turning my gaze to address the extended family. "You all remember 5 years ago when Terrence launched his consulting firm. You remember how he strutted into this very dining room, popping champagne and bragging about a group of elite anonymous angel investors who saw his unbridled genius and funded his entire operation. You remember how he loved to tell everyone that he built his empire entirely on his own, without a single dime of my corporate money." Vivian's face had gone chalk white. Roland was staring at the abandoned document on the table, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. "Those angel investors did not exist." I continued pacing slowly behind my chair, enjoying the absolute command I held over the room. Terrence was drowning in debt. His credit score was a disaster. No bank would touch him. So I quietly hired my attorney to establish a blind trust and a dummy corporation. We called it Apex Holdings. I was the angel investor. I funded the sleek office space. I funded his payroll. I funded the expensive tailored suits he wore to play the part of a successful entrepreneur. I was not the quiet, supportive wife standing in the shadows of his greatness. I was his sole creditor. I owned his debt. I owned him. Terrence found his voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged, desperate whisper. You cannot do this, Maya. You waived your spousal right to the firm in the divorce settlement. I read that part. You signed it. I did sign it. I agreed, offering him a cold, empty smile. I formally waived my right to half the firm as your wife. But I did not waive my rights as your primary corporate lien holder. By rushing to sign that specific uncontested divorce settlement to keep your money away from me, you legally verified all outstanding debts and liens against your business entity. You acknowledged on the public record that Apex Holdings holds the primary lien on all your corporate assets. But that is not even the best part. I stopped pacing and leaned forward, resting my manicured hands on the edge of the polished mahogany table. I looked directly at Keisha, whose face was rapidly transforming from smug satisfaction into raw, dawning horror. The original funding contract for Apex Holdings included a very specific morality trigger, I explained, making sure every single syllable echoed clearly. The contract stipulated that any moral turpitude specifically defined as infidelity, resulting in a child born out of wedlock, would trigger an immediate call on the entire principal of the loan. By putting in writing that you were leaving our marriage because Keisha is pregnant with your twins, you officially confessed to the triggering event. You literally handed me the loaded gun, Terrence. How much? Roland barked, his voice cracking with panic as he looked at his son, then back at me. How much does he owe you? As of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, factoring in the compound interest, explicitly detailed in the original contract, your son owes Apex Holdings $2.5 million, I stated smoothly. Payable immediately in full. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. One of the aunts actually clutched her chest. $2.5 million was a death sentence. It was a sum of money Terrence could not even dream of liquidating. He is completely bankrupt. I continued, turning my attention back to Vivian, who looked like she was going to be sick. The accounts have already been frozen by the courts. The business he thought he won in the divorce is currently being liquidated to pay me back. The client lists the intellectual property, the office furniture, the company cars. Everything reverts to me. He does not own a firm. He does not own an empire. He is an unemployed, penniless fraud who is about to be drowning in child support payments he cannot possibly afford. I looked down at Keisha. She was hyperventilating. The luxury life she thought she had stolen from me was vanishing before her very eyes. She had plotted and schemed to trap a wealthy titan of industry, only to realize she had trapped a hollow shell of a man funded entirely by his wife. The Midtown condo was gone. The bank accounts were frozen. The lavish future she envisioned for herself and her twins was nothing but smoke and mirrors. She looked at Terrence with a level of disgust and pure hatred that almost made me pity him. Almost. You ruined me! Terrence shouted, his voice cracking as tears of frustration welled in his eyes. You set me up. You planned this from the very beginning. You are a cold, heartless sociopath, Maya. You destroyed my entire life over a mistake. I did not force you into another woman's bed, Terrence, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. I did not force you to lie to my face for months while I was going through agonizing fertility treatments. I did not force you to strut around this city spending my money while complaining to your family that I was too corporate and stiff. You dug your own grave. I am simply the one pushing the dirt over the casket. The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. Vivian began wailing loudly, clinging to Roland's arm, demanding that someone call an attorney, screaming that this had to be illegal. Keisha was sobbing, shoving Terrence away when he tried to put a comforting hand on her shoulder, cursing at him for lying to her about his finances. Terrence was pacing frantically, dragging his hands over his face, completely broken. Suddenly, a massive fist slammed down onto the mahogany table with the force of a gunshot. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently, splashing dark red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. Enough. The booming voice silenced the room instantly. Malik Terrence's older brother pushed his chair back and stood up. At 6'4", Malik was a physically imposing man. He was the golden boy of the family, the successful, untouchable older brother who always commanded absolute respect. He walked around the table, his heavy footsteps thudding against the floorboards, and stopped directly in front of me. He towered over me, his chest puffed out, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into backing down. "You are a vindictive witch!" Maya Malik spat, his voice shaking with righteous fury. He pointed an aggressive finger inches from my face. "This is sick. You are destroying my brother's life over a bruised ego. You are literally taking food out of the mouths of his newborn babies. You come into our parents' house, disrespect our family, and try to ruin a man because you could not give him what he needed. You are nothing but a bitter, barren monster. Fix this right now, or I swear to God I will personally make sure you never practice corporate law in this city again." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I maintained my posture, feeling the satisfying weight of the crumpled neonatal laboratory report sitting in the inside pocket of my blazer. I let Malik finish his grand protective speech. I let him play the role of the righteous defender of the family name. I looked past his shoulder and caught Sarah's eye at the far end of the table. She was standing now, gripping the back of her chair, her face a mask of cold, unwavering resolve. She gave me a single definitive nod. I turned my attention back to Malik, my eyes deadlocking with his. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. "Are you sure you want to defend him, Malik?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried perfectly through the dead silent room. "Because you should be worrying about your own kids." The heavy cream paper trembled violently in Terrence's hands. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant, triumphant smirk that had plastered his face just seconds prior completely melted away, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, darting back and forth as if searching my face for a punchline to a sick joke. There was no joke. There was only the airtight legal trap I had meticulously built around him over the last 5 years. "Read it out loud, Terrence," I instructed, my voice slicing through the suffocating silence of the dining room. "Read the clause you so eagerly ignored when you signed our uncontested divorce settlement yesterday morning. Read the part where you willingly surrendered your entire life to me." Terrence swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He simply dropped the paper onto the mahogany table as if it had physically burned his fingers. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the side of Keisha's chair. "Since my ex-husband has suddenly lost his ability to speak, I will gladly break down the legalese for everyone in the room," I said, turning my gaze to address the extended family. "You all remember 5 years ago when Terrence launched his consulting firm. You remember how he strutted into this very dining room popping champagne and bragging about a group of elite anonymous angel investors who saw his unbridled genius and funded his entire operation. You remember how he loved to tell everyone that he built his empire entirely on his own, without a single dime of my corporate money." Vivian's face had gone chalk white. Roland was staring at the abandoned document on the table, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. "Those angel investors did not exist." I continued pacing slowly behind my chair, enjoying the absolute command I held over the room. Terrence was drowning in debt. His credit score was a disaster. No bank would touch him. So I quietly hired my attorney to establish a blind trust and a dummy corporation. We called it Apex Holdings. I was the angel investor. I funded the sleek office space. I funded his payroll. I funded the expensive tailored suits he wore to play the part of a successful entrepreneur. I was not the quiet, supportive wife standing in the shadows of his greatness. I was his sole creditor. I owned his debt. I owned him. Terrence found his voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged, desperate whisper. "You cannot do this, Maya. You waived your spousal right to the firm in the divorce settlement. I read that part. You signed it. I did sign it, I agreed, offering him a cold, empty smile. I formally waived my right to half the firm as your wife. But I did not waive my rights as your primary corporate lien holder. By rushing to sign that specific uncontested divorce settlement to keep your money away from me, you legally verified all outstanding debts and liens against your business entity. You acknowledged on the public record that Apex Holdings holds the primary lien on all your corporate assets. But that is not even the best part. I stopped pacing and leaned forward, resting my manicured hands on the edge of the polished mahogany table. I looked directly at Keisha, whose face was rapidly transforming from smug satisfaction into raw, dawning horror. The original funding contract for Apex Holdings included a very specific morality trigger, I explained, making sure every single syllable echoed clearly. The contract stipulated that any moral turpitude specifically defined as infidelity, resulting in a child born out of wedlock, would trigger an immediate call on the entire principle of the loan. By putting in writing that you were leaving our marriage because Keisha is pregnant with your twins, you officially confessed to the triggering event. You literally handed me the loaded gun, Terrence. How much? Roland barked, his voice cracking with panic as he looked at his son, then back at me. How much does he owe you as of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, factoring in the compound interest explicitly detailed in the original contract? Your son owes Apex Holdings $2.5 million, I stated smoothly. Payable immediately in full. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. One of the aunts actually clutched her chest. $2.5 million was a death sentence. It was a sum of money Terrence could not even dream of liquidating. He is completely bankrupt. I continued, turning my attention back to Vivian, who looked like she was going to be sick. The accounts have already been frozen by the courts. The business he thought he won in the divorce is currently being liquidated to pay me back. The client lists the intellectual property, the office furniture, the company cars. Everything reverts to me. He does not own a firm. He does not own an empire. He is an unemployed, penniless fraud who is about to be drowning in child support payments he cannot possibly afford. I looked down at Keisha. She was hyperventilating. The luxury life she thought she had stolen from me was vanishing before her very eyes. She had plotted and schemed to trap a wealthy titan of industry, only to realize she had trapped a hollow shell of a man funded entirely by his wife. The Midtown condo was gone. The bank accounts were frozen. The lavish future she envisioned for herself and her twins was nothing but smoke and mirrors. She looked at Terrence with a level of disgust and pure hatred that almost made me pity him. Almost. "You ruined me!" Terrence shouted, his voice cracking as tears of frustration welled in his eyes. "You set me up. You planned this from the very beginning. You are a cold, heartless sociopath, Maya. You destroyed my entire life over a mistake." "I did not force you into another woman's bed, Terrence," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "I did not force you to lie to my face for months while I was going through agonizing fertility treatments. I did not force you to strut around this city spending my money while complaining to your family that I was too corporate and stiff. You dug your own grave. I am simply the one pushing the dirt over the casket." The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. Vivian began wailing loudly, clinging to Roland's arm, demanding that someone call an attorney, screaming that this had to be illegal. Keisha was sobbing, shoving Terrence away when he tried to put a comforting hand on her shoulder, cursing at him for lying to her about his finances. Terrence was pacing frantically, dragging his hands over his face, completely broken. Suddenly, a massive fist slammed down onto the mahogany table with the force of a gunshot. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently, splashing dark red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Enough!" The booming voice silenced the room instantly. Malik, Terrence's older brother, pushed his chair back and stood up. At 6'4", Malik was a physically imposing man. He was the golden boy of the family, the successful, untouchable older brother who always commanded absolute respect. He walked around the table, his heavy footsteps thudding against the floorboards, and stopped directly in front of me. He towered over me, his chest puffed out, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into backing down. "You are a vindictive witch!" Maya Malik spat, his voice shaking with righteous fury. He pointed an aggressive finger inches from my face. This is sick. You are destroying my brother's life over a bruised ego. You are literally taking food out of the mouths of his newborn babies. You come into our parents' house, disrespect our family, and try to ruin a man because you could not give him what he needed. You are nothing but a bitter, barren monster. Fix this right now, or I swear to God I will personally make sure you never practice corporate law in this city again. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I maintained my posture, feeling the satisfying weight of the crumpled neonatal laboratory report sitting in the inside pocket of my blazer. I let Malik finish his grand protective speech. I let him play the role of the righteous defender of the family name. I looked past his shoulder and caught Sarah's eye at the far end of the table. She was standing now, gripping the back of her chair, her face a mask of cold, unwavering resolve. She gave me a single, definitive nod. I turned my attention back to Malik, my eyes deadlocking with his. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. Are you sure you want to defend him? Malik, I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried perfectly through the dead silent room. Because you should be worrying about your own kids. The silence following my question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Malik's broad shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. His jaw slackens. The righteous anger that fueled his little speech evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, creeping dread. He looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face for a bluff. But I did not bluff. I am a wealth manager. I deal exclusively in hard facts and undeniable evidence. I took a slow, deliberate step to my right, clearing the grand archway that separated the dining room from the darkened foyer. Sarah stepped out from the shadows. The collective gasp from the dining table was audible. This was not the Sarah they knew. The Sarah they knew was practically invisible. For years, she had been the quiet, obedient daughter-in-law, who sat at the far end of Vivian's table picking at her food and absorbing a relentless barrage of passive-aggressive insults. Vivian had mocked everything from Sarah's unseasoned side dishes to her timid, apologetic posture. Malik had never once raised his voice to defend her. He simply let his mother tear his wife apart week after week. But the woman walking into the dining room right now was unrecognizable. She was not wearing her usual pastel, oversized cardigans meant to make her blend into the background. She was wearing a sharp, structured black trench coat. Her posture was rigid, her spine completely straight. Her blue eyes, usually cast downward in submission, were burning with a feral, unyielding rage. Sarah marched directly toward the center of the mahogany table. Vivian immediately attempted to assert her dominance, slamming her hand on the table and demanding to know why Sarah was lurking in the shadows and disrespecting their family celebration. Sarah did not even look at Vivian. She ignored the matriarch entirely, a first in the history of this family. Sarah stopped right in front of Malik. She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a massive, heavy stack of papers bound by a thick metal clip. She lifted the stack high into the air and slammed it down onto the polished mahogany table with a deafening crack. The sound made Terrence physically flinch. "Those are your late nights at the firm," Malik Sarah said. Her voice did not shake. It rang out loud and crystal clear, slicing through the heavy scent of roasted garlic and expensive wine. "Those are your emergency weekend strategy sessions. Those are the sudden, unavoidable, out-of-state depositions you had to attend while I stayed home alone." Malik stared at the thick stack of papers as if it were a venomous snake. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some smooth, practiced lie, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. Sarah did not wait for his defense. She turned to face the entire room, her gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the aunts, the uncles, and finally Vivian. "For years you have forced me to manage the master family calendar," Vivian Sarah said, her tone dripping with newfound authority. "You demanded that I track every flight, every vacation, every business trip, and every Sunday dinner. You treated me like a glorified administrative assistant. But you forgot one crucial detail. Tracking all that data gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of everyone's timeline. Sarah pointed a sharp manicured finger directly at Keisha, who was shrinking back into her chair, her eyes darting toward the exits. When Keisha proudly announced her pregnancy and shared her exact due date, I did the math. Sarah continued, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She claimed the babies were conceived during the 3rd week of October. But I managed the calendar. I knew for an absolute fact that Terrence was on a mandatory continuous consulting tour in Chicago during that entire week. Terrence was not even in the state of Georgia. He was freezing in a hotel room in the Midwest. Terrence slowly turned his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Keisha. He looked like a man who had just been gutted. Sarah reached down and flipped open the heavy stack of papers, spreading the pages out across the table for everyone to see. They were printed text message logs, hundreds of them highlighted and organized with terrifying precision. "But you know who was in Georgia?" Sarah asked, her voice rising in pitch and intensity. "My husband. Malik told me he was pulling all-nighters at the firm to prepare for a massive corporate litigation trial. But he was not at the firm. He was at Keisha's apartment." Sarah began reading the highlighted texts aloud. She read Malik telling Keisha how beautiful she looked in the dress he bought her. She read Keisha complaining to Malik that Terrence was a broke, struggling loser who could not afford to buy her the jewelry she deserved. She read the logistics, the planning, the explicit, undeniable proof of their affair. The room was paralyzed. Vivian was clutching her chest, taking short, shallow breaths, as her perfect, pristine family image shattered into a million jagged pieces. Roland had buried his face in his hands, completely defeated. "You see, Maya was right," Sarah said, turning to look at me with a fierce, burning solidarity. "Keisha is a parasite. She wanted the family wealth, and she did not care which brother provided it. She realized very quickly that Terrence was a massive financial risk. His consulting firm was struggling, he had no real assets, so she cast a wider net. She set her sights on the older, successful brother. She brought Malik in as an insurance policy. She slept with both of them during the exact same window to ensure she secured a permanent bag, hedging her bets so she could trap whichever brother ended up being the father." Malik finally broke his silence. He lunged across the table, grabbing the papers, desperately trying to gather them up and hide them from the room. He shouted that Sarah was insane, that these messages were fabricated, that she had lost her mind and needed psychiatric help. But it was too late. The aunts and uncles had already seen the pages. The truth was out, ugly and undeniable. Keisha realized her entire world was collapsing. The luxury condo was gone. Terrence was bankrupt. Her affair with Malik was exposed. She resorted to the only weapon she had left. She went on the offensive. Keisha jumped to her feet, knocking her chair backward. She pointed a trembling, furious finger at Sarah and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She called Sarah a delusional, racist liar. She shouted that Sarah had always been jealous of her because Keisha was a strong, vibrant black woman who seamlessly fit into the family culture, while Sarah was just a weak, pathetic outsider who could not even keep her own husband satisfied. Keisha turned to Vivian, her voice cracking with manufactured tears, begging the matriarch to throw this crazy, bitter woman out of the house. She insisted that Sarah hacked her phone and altered the messages just to ruin the joyous birth of Terrence's children. Terrence was shaking. He looked at his brother, who was refusing to make eye contact with him, and then he looked at Keisha. He dropped to his knees right there on the expensive Persian rug, ignoring the aunts, the uncles, and the sheer humiliation of the moment. He grabbed Keisha's hands, gripping them so tightly, her knuckles turned white. "Tell me it is a lie," Keisha Terrence begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob. "Tell me she made this up. Tell me those are my babies. Please, just tell me they are mine." Keisha stammered, her eyes darting wildly around the room. She tried to force a reassuring smile, tried to tell Terrence that of course they were his, that Sarah was just trying to destroy their beautiful family because her own marriage was a failure. But she was stammering, she was sweating. The conviction was gone. The triumphant queen who insulted my fertility just an hour ago was reduced to a cornered, panicked animal spewing empty defenses. The chaos in the dining room reached a deafening pitch. Malik was yelling at Sarah. Vivian was sobbing into her napkin. Terrence was on his knees begging for a lie he could believe in. It was the perfect, beautiful crescendo. The Sunday illusion was completely dead. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my white crepe suit, and stepped back into the center of the room. The clicking of my heels drew the attention of the front half of the table. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer, my fingers wrapping around the crisp folded medical file Sarah had shoved into my chest at the hospital. I pulled the document out, the stark white paper contrasting sharply against my crimson nails. I held it up, waiting for the screaming to die down. It took a few seconds, but the sight of the official hospital letterhead finally commanded their silence. Terrence slowly looked up from the floor, his tear-streaked face pale and terrified. Keisha froze her breath, hitching in her throat as she recognized the logo of the Atlanta General Hospital Genetics Department. I looked directly at Keisha, feeling absolutely nothing but glorious, freezing vindication. I held the medical file up for the entire room to see. The heavy cardstock of the Atlanta General Hospital file hit the mahogany table with a resounding thud. It was a sharp final sound, like a gavel coming down to issue a death sentence. Every pair of eyes in the room snapped to the crisp white folder, resting just inches from Terrence's trembling hands. Keisha stopped screaming. Her mouth snapped shut, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. She recognized that folder. She knew exactly what was inside it, and I watched the sheer terror hollow out her eyes. Terrence stared at the folder, his chest heaving, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the ground crumbling beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. "What is that?" Maya Terrence asked, his voice raw and stripped of all its former arrogance. "What did you do?" "I did nothing, Terrence," I replied, my voice smooth, perfectly calibrated, and entirely devoid of sympathy. "Sarah did the heavy lifting. While you were busy signing over your non-existent empire to me, your sister-in-law was making a quiet, perfectly legal visit to the records department. You see, when a high-risk pregnancy involving twins requires specialized genetic testing, the hospital generates incredibly detailed reports. Reports that get filed under the primary insurance holder. And since you do not actually have corporate insurance, Terrence Keisha had to use the premium coverage provided by the older, more stable brother, Malik's insurance." Malik took a sharp step back, his broad shoulders suddenly slumping. He looked at Sarah, but Sarah did not even blink. She just stood there, her chin held high, watching her husband's pristine reputation burn to ash. "Let us have a quick biology lesson," I announced, walking slowly around the perimeter of the table. I made sure to meet the eyes of every single aunt and uncle, sitting in paralyzed silence. Most people think twins are simple. Identical twins come from one split egg. Fraternal twins come from two separate eggs fertilized at the exact same time. But there is a third incredibly rare medical phenomenon. It is called heteropaternal superfecundation. I paused, letting the clinical multisyllabic term hang heavily in the stale air of the dining room. The extended family was captivated, holding their collective breath as they watched the destruction of the family's golden boys unfold in real time. It happens when a woman releases two eggs during a single ovulation cycle. I continued, my voice carrying the steady, relentless cadence of a college professor delivering a final exam. And those two separate eggs are fertilized by two entirely different men within a very short window of time. It requires a very specific, very busy schedule. I stopped walking and looked directly at Keisha, who was gripping the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. "A schedule you maintained with ruthless, calculated efficiency." Keisha shook her head frantically, tears spilling over her dramatic eyelashes. "Do not listen to her, Terrence," she pleaded, her voice shrill and desperate. "She is crazy. She forged that document. She is just trying to tear us apart because she is jealous." I ignored her pathetic display. I reached across the table, flipped the heavy folder open, and smoothed my hand over the crisp medical report. According to the non-invasive prenatal paternity test conducted exactly 3 weeks ago, I read aloud, ensuring my voice reached the darkest corners of the hallway. "There are two distinct fetal DNA profiles present in the maternal blood sample. Fetus A shows a 99.9% probability of paternity, matching the genetic markers of Terrence. Terrence let out a sudden, ragged breath. A fleeting look of profound relief crossed his tear-stained face. His shoulders dropped and he looked at Keisha as if she had just been exonerated. He actually believed he had won. He actually believed the nightmare was over. But I did not close the folder. However, I said, my voice rising in volume, slicing through his momentary relief like a scalpel. Fetus B possesses an entirely different paternal genetic profile. Fetus B shows a 99.9% probability of paternity, matching a different male within the immediate biological family line. I dropped the paper back onto the table. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a massive explosion. I looked dead into Malik's terrified eyes. "Congratulations, Malik," I said, offering him a cold, empty smile. "You are also going to be a father." The dining room erupted into sheer, unadulterated pandemonium. It was a volcanic explosion of screaming, crying, and breaking glass. Aunt Patricia let out a loud shriek and actually fainted into the arms of Uncle Marcus. Glasses were knocked over, spilling red wine across the fine linen tablecloth like fresh blood. Terrence stood completely frozen for 3 agonizing seconds as his brain processed the catastrophic biological reality. His wife had slept with his brother. His brother was the father of his child's twin. The ultimate betrayal had occurred under his own roof. The realization snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity he had left. Terrence let out a guttural, animalistic roar that tore from the very bottom of his chest. He lunged across the mahogany table, entirely ignoring the expensive china and silver platters. He grabbed Malik by the collar of his tailored shirt, his hands twisting the fabric violently. "You slept with her!" Terrence screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he shoved his older brother backward. "You slept with her while I was away. You told me you were helping her with her lease. You told me you were giving her financial advice." Malik stumbled backward, his arms raised in a frantic defensive posture. "Terrence, wait, let me explain," Malik shouted over the din of the chaotic room. "It meant nothing. She came on to me. She threw herself at me, man. I swear to God it was a mistake." "A mistake," Terrence roared, landing a heavy, uncoordinated punch across Malik's jaw. The impact sent Malik crashing into the antique china cabinet. Glass shattered, raining down onto the floor in a cascade of glittering shards. "You put a baby in her, you traitor. You destroyed my life." The brothers tackled each other to the floor, rolling over the thick Persian rug in a violent tangle of fists and expensive suits. Uncles rushed forward, shouting and pulling at their arms, desperately trying to pry the 2 grown men apart. The pristine, sophisticated facade of the family was completely obliterated, replaced by raw, violent dysfunction. Through the absolute madness, I glanced over at Sarah. She was standing exactly where I left her. She reached forward calmly, picked up her crystal water glass, and took a slow, elegant sip. She watched her husband bleed on the floor with an expression of profound, unshakable peace. The timid woman was dead. She had orchestrated the perfect execution, and she was savoring every single second of the fallout. Keisha was backed into a corner, sobbing hysterically, sliding down the wall until she sat on the floor, her hands covering her face. She had played a dangerous high-stakes game of greed, assuming she could outsmart everyone in the room. Now she had nothing. Terrence finally broke free from the scrum. His lip was bleeding, and his shirt was torn open, exposing his chest. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he looked around the ruined dining room. His eyes were wide, wild, and desperate for an anchor. He needed someone to fix this. He needed the one person who had always cleaned up his messes, paid off his debts, and protected him from the consequences of his own arrogance. Terrence spun around and looked directly at his mother. "Mom," Terrence choked out, his voice cracking like a terrified child. "Mom, tell them this is a mistake. Fix this." He expected Vivian to rush forward. He expected her to wrap her arms around him, to scream at me, to scream at Sarah, to demand that her precious son be treated with respect. He expected the fierce, overbearing matriarch to faint from the sheer shock of the scandal and command the sympathy of the entire room. But Vivian did not rush forward. She did not scream. She did not faint. I watched Vivian closely, studying the microscopic shifts in her posture. She was standing near the head of the table, gripping the back of her chair. Her face was not flushed with righteous anger. It was completely drained of blood. She was paler than the linen tablecloth. Her eyes were wide not with maternal outrage, but with a deep, paralyzing terror. She was staring at Keisha, who was still weeping on the floor. Vivian slowly raised a trembling hand and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the pregnant woman cowering in the corner. Her mouth opened and she spoke in a whisper so strained and horrifying that it cut straight through the lingering noise of the room. "The boy did not tell you." Vivian breathed, her voice cracking with a terrifying realization. "The boy did not tell you." "Hell." Terence froze. The violent, chaotic thrashing on the Persian rug came to an abrupt and jarring halt. Malik shoved his younger brother off his chest, gasping for air, but Terence did not fight back. He did not even look at Malik. His eyes were locked entirely onto his mother. The sheer unadulterated rage that had propelled him across the dining room table completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, paralyzing confusion. Vivian stood near the head of the mahogany table, completely paralyzed. Her hand hovered in the air, trembling violently. The reality of what she had just let slip washed over her face, draining the last remnants of her perfectly curated matriarchal composure. She realized her mistake. The secret she had buried, the conspiracy she had managed with such ruthless efficiency, had just slipped past her lips in a moment of pure, unfiltered panic. "Tell me what Ma," Terence asked. His voice was no longer a roar. It was a hollow, echoing whisper that barely carried over the sound of Malik's heavy breathing. Terence slowly climbed to his feet, ignoring the blood dripping from his split lip and the torn fabric of his custom-tailored shirt. He stumbled a few steps toward the head of the table, his eyes wide and desperate. "Tell me what Malik was supposed to tell me. What did you know?" Vivian could not form a single sentence. She opened her mouth, but the only sound that escaped was a choked, agonizing gasp. She collapsed backward into her heavy, ornate dining chair, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders began to shake with violent, uncontrollable sobs. The iron-fisted ruler of the family had been reduced to a weeping, hyperventilating mess. I watched her pathetic display with absolute clinical detachment. I felt no pity for the woman who had spent years making my life a living hell. It was time to deliver the final, fatal blow to the illusion of this perfect family. I smoothed the lapels of my white crepe suit, my low heels tapping sharply against the hardwood floor as I stepped into the very center of the room. Since Vivian has suddenly lost her ability to string a coherent sentence together, I will gladly connect the final devastating dots for everyone in this room, I announced. I made sure my tone was loud, commanding, and impossible to ignore. I swept my gaze across the shocked faces of the aunts, the uncles, and the cousins who were still reeling from the DNA revelation. Because this is not just a story about a greedy mistress and two foolish, arrogant brothers. This is a story about a mother who decided exactly which one of her sons was expendable. I turned to Sarah. She stood tall at the edge of the room, her arms crossed over her sharp black trench coat, her blue eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding light. "You all treated Sarah like a timid, pathetic little mouse," I said, gesturing toward her. Vivian mocked her, cooking her clothes, her quiet nature. "You all laughed at her behind her back and treated her like she was lucky to have married into your prestigious family. But you all conveniently ignored the fact that Sarah comes from old generational wealth. Her family owns half the commercial real estate in Savannah. They have trusts that have been accumulating interest since the 1920s. And Roland's development firm has been hemorrhaging money for the better part of a decade." I looked at Roland, who was sitting frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with impending doom. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles looked as though they might burst through his skin. "I bailed you out of your massive corporate losses in 2019, Roland." I continued pacing slowly down the length of the table. "But that was a one-time patch. To secure the massive ongoing lines of credit you needed to keep your failing business afloat for the long term, you required a guarantor with impeccable financial standing. You required the backing of Sarah's family trust. You used your daughter-in-law as a permanent financial shield." The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. "If Sarah ever discovered the truth and divorced Malik," I said, projecting my voice so every syllable landed with maximum impact, "she would take her generational wealth with her. The credit lines would vanish. The investors would pull out. Roland's business would instantly collapse, and this beautiful ancestral estate would be auctioned off by the bank to the highest bidder. Malik's marriage was the only thing keeping this entire family off the street. I stopped pacing and looked down at Vivian. She was weeping into her hands, refusing to look at me, refusing to look at her sons. 6 months ago, Vivian hired a private investigator, I revealed. Several of the aunts gasped out loud. She noticed Malik acting strange. She noticed the missing funds from his joint accounts with Sarah. She wanted to make sure her golden boy was not doing anything foolish that might jeopardize the family cash cow. The investigator followed Malik straight to Keisha's apartment. Vivian found out about the affair, and she panicked, because she knew Sarah. She knew that if Sarah discovered Malik was sleeping with a bartender, Sarah would leave him, the money would be gone, the empire would fall. So Vivian confronted Keisha in secret. Keisha whimpered from her spot on the floor. She wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to make herself as small as possible. I did not spare her a single ounce of mercy. Vivian learned that Keisha was sleeping with both brothers. I continued turning my attention back to Terrence. She learned Keisha was pregnant, and Vivian realized she had a massive ticking time bomb on her hands. If Keisha demanded a paternity test, Malik could be exposed. Sarah would file for divorce. The family would be ruined. Vivian needed a permanent foolproof distraction. She needed a fall guy to step up, claim Keisha, and claim those babies so that no one would ever question Malik's involvement. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Terrence. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. He looked like a man standing on the tracks watching a freight train barrel toward him, entirely unable to move. "She chose you, Terrence," I said quietly, letting the absolute cruelty of the statement sink deep into his bones. "Your own mother chose you as the sacrificial lamb, as the—" Terrence shook his head back and forth in a jerky, erratic motion. "No," he whispered. "No, that is not true. Think about the last 6 months," I commanded him, my voice sharpening into a lethal blade. "Think about who suddenly started whispering in your ear. Vivian spent hours telling you how brilliant you were. She told you that I was holding you back. She told you that you deserved a woman who respected you, a woman who would give you the traditional family I refused to provide. She knew Keisha was a parasite, but she pushed you directly into her arms. She inflated your ego because she needed you to be arrogant enough to walk away from our marriage." Terrence's jaw dropped. The memories were clearly flashing through his mind, clicking into place one by one. "Vivian orchestrated this entire divorce," I said, driving the final nail into the coffin. "She encouraged you to leave me. She encouraged you to move Keisha into a luxury condo. She encouraged you to publicly claim those twins before they were even born. She stroked your massive ego because she knew exactly how to manipulate you. She knew you were desperate to prove you were a bigger man than Malik. She used your pride to blind you to the truth. She sacrificed you to save Malik." The dining room was completely suffocated by the weight of my words. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe. Vivian's sobs had quieted into a pathetic, rhythmic wheezing. "She let you walk away from your marriage," I continued, pointing a finger directly at Vivian's bowed head. "She let you trigger the morality clause in your funding contract. She let you take on $2.5 million in immediate debt. She let you forfeit your consulting firm to me. She watched you destroy your entire financial future, your reputation, and your life, and she smiled while you did it. Because as long as you believed those babies were yours, Malik was safe. Sarah's money was safe. Vivian's precious country club lifestyle was safe. She sold your life to pay for her mortgage." Terrence could not process the magnitude of the betrayal. His mind was fracturing. He looked at the shattered glass of the antique china cabinet on the floor. He looked at Malik, who was bleeding and refusing to meet his eye. He looked at Keisha, the woman who had played him for an absolute fool. Finally, his gaze settled on his mother. Terrence stared at Vivian. This was the woman who had given him life. This was the woman who had coddled him, praised him, and shaped his entire worldview. He realized in that agonizing moment that she did not love him. She loved the image of the family. She loved the generational wealth. And above all else, she loved Malik more. Terrence's hands fell limply to his sides. His shoulders caved inward. All the bravado, all the smug entitlement he had carried into this room had been utterly vaporized. He looked at his mother as if she were the devil incarnate. "You sacrificed me," Terence whispered, his voice cracking, the absolute devastation radiating from every single syllable. "You sacrificed me to save his bank account." Vivian's silence was the loudest confession in the room. She shrank back into her ornate chair, her manicured hands trembling over her face as she refused to meet Terence's gaze. The absolute certainty of her betrayal settled over Terence like a physical weight. The golden child was protected. The spare was slaughtered. Terence let out a sound that was barely human, a raw, ragged scream that tore from his throat and echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He pivoted on his heel and launched himself entirely across the shattered remains of the dining table. He bypassed the spilled wine and the ruined china, tackling Malik to the floor with a terrifying, unhinged ferocity. The room exploded into total warfare. The pristine country club illusion of the family completely vaporized in an instant. Terence threw a heavy, sickening punch that connected squarely with Malik's jaw, snapping the older brother's head back against the hardwood floor. Malik scrambled to defend himself, throwing wild, blind strikes, but Terence was fueled by a pure, blinding adrenaline born of absolute devastation. He grabbed Malik by the collar of his ruined custom shirt and slammed him downward again and again. Uncle Marcus and Uncle David rushed forward, shouting frantically as they grabbed Terence by the shoulders. It took both grown men throwing their entire body weight backward to drag Terence off his older brother. Terence thrashed violently in their grip, kicking his legs and screaming until his vocal cords frayed. He cursed Malik, promising to ruin him, promising to take everything he had left. Sarah simply stepped back safely out of range, watching the men destroy each other with a terrifyingly calm smile on her face. Keisha thought she saw an opening. Desperate to salvage any piece of the luxury life she had envisioned, she crawled across the floor toward Terence. She reached out with trembling hands, grabbing at the fabric of his trousers. She sobbed his name, begging him to look at her, claiming she loved him, claiming they could still raise the twins together, claiming that Malik forced himself on her. Terence ripped his leg out of her grasp with a violently sharp motion, effectively kicking her hands away. He backed up, his chest heaving as he looked down at her with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Do not ever touch me again." Terence spat, his voice shaking with venom. "You are a parasite. You crawled into my bed and let me plan a future with you while you were sleeping with my brother down the hall. You let my mother use you to destroy my life. Get away from me. Get out of my sight before I do something I regret." Keisha scrambled backward, terrified by the dark, empty look in his eyes. She pressed her back against the wall, weeping hysterically, finally realizing that her grand master plan had completely collapsed. There was no bag to secure. There was no mansion waiting for her. There was only the shattered debris of the lives she helped ruin. Terence turned his fury back toward the head of the table. Roland was still sitting frozen in his chair, too cowardly to intervene, too cowardly to even look his youngest son in the eye. Vivian was weeping softly, the matriarch completely stripped of her power. Terence stalked toward them, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He did not yell this time. He spoke with a quiet, lethal intensity that was somehow much more terrifying. "I spent 35 years trying to prove I was good enough for you," Terence said, his voice trembling with years of buried resentment. "Every single thing I did, every business I tried to build, every milestone I reached, you compared it to Malik. Malik got the trust fund for his law degree while I had to take out loans. Malik got the down payment for his house while you told me I needed to build character. I played your game. I brought home the perfect corporate wife to boost your image. I funded your failing real estate deals by proxy. I gave you everything I had." Vivian shook her head, tears streaming through her expensive makeup. "We love you, Terence," she sobbed. "We were just trying to protect the family." "Protect the family?" Terence repeated, letting out a harsh, broken laugh. "You mean protect Malik? You mean protect the money? You discovered my brother was a cheating, reckless liability, and instead of holding him accountable, you threw me in front of the train. You sat in my living room, drank my wine, and convinced me that Maya was the problem. You convinced me to throw away a loyal wife for a woman you knew was carrying your other son's child. You let me take on millions of dollars in debt. You let me forfeit my entire business. You fed me to the wolves just so you could keep your country club memberships and your fancy dinners. Roland finally found his voice, attempting a weak, pathetic defense. Son, we did not know Maya had secured the firm. We thought you would walk away clean. We thought you would just start over. You thought I would be your convenient idiot? Terence snarled, pointing a shaking finger directly at his father's face. You are a coward, old man. You let your wife run this family into the ground, and you let her sacrifice your own son because you are too weak to manage your own failing ledgers. You are both dead to me. Do you hear me? I have no parents. The finality of his words hung in the air. Vivian let out a loud, agonizing wail, reaching out for him. But Terence turned his back on her entirely. The absolute rejection broke the matriarch completely. She slumped over the mahogany table, weeping into the ruined linen cloth. Terence stood in the center of the wreckage. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the reality of his situation fully crystallized in his mind. He was completely bankrupt. His business was gone. His accounts were frozen. His family had betrayed him. The woman carrying his child was a manipulative fraud who had slept with his brother. He had absolutely nothing left. Slowly, his frantic gaze settled on me. I was standing near the archway, completely untouched by the physical and emotional carnage that had just ripped through the room. My white crepe suit was spotless. My posture was perfectly straight. I was the only stable, grounded force remaining in his entire universe. I watched the last shred of Terence's pride evaporate. The arrogant, boastful entrepreneur died right there on the floorboards. He took a slow, trembling step toward me, then another. Maya, he whispered, his voice cracking with a pathetic, childlike desperation. He closed the distance between us and fell heavily to his knees right on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. He reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the hem of my tailored coat, gripping the fabric as if he were drowning in the ocean, and I was the only life raft in sight. Maya, please. Terence sobbed, tears flowing freely down his face, dripping off his chin and onto the floor. I am so sorry. I was blind. I was an absolute fool. They played me. My own mother played me. They poisoned my mind against you. They told me you did not care about me, but you were the only one who ever did. You were the only one who funded me. You believed in me when my own family treated me like garbage. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had lied to my face for months. I did not pull my coat away. I simply let him cling to it, letting him fully experience the absolute humiliation of his current position. Please, Maya, he begged, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. Rip up the contract, please. Tear up the debt collection. I will do anything you want. I will spend the rest of my life making this up to you. We can go back to how it was. I will drop Keisha. I will walk away from this entire toxic family. It will just be you and me. I have nothing left, Maya. They took everything from me. Please take me back. I need you. I cannot survive this. He buried his face against my leg, weeping openly, entirely stripped of his dignity in front of his aunts, his uncles, and his bleeding brother. He was a broken, pathetic shell of a man, offering me a hollow apology, born entirely out of financial terror. I looked down at him. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but the cold, hard satisfaction of total victory. Before I could even open my mouth to respond to his pathetic groveling, a loud, heavy click echoed through the foyer behind me. The heavy oak front door of the ancestral estate swung open, the hinges groaning slightly in the quiet house. The sudden noise caused the remaining family members to turn their heads. Julian, my lead corporate attorney, stepped into the grand foyer. He was dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, his expression perfectly neutral and entirely professional. He wiped his feet on the entry mat, unbothered by the sheer chaos radiating from the dining room. In his right hand, he carried a thick, heavy leather briefcase. He walked up to stand directly beside me, looking down at Terence with clinical indifference. He adjusted his glasses completely, ignoring the bleeding brother on the floor and the weeping matriarch at the table. "Right on time, Julian," I said, keeping my eyes locked on my ex-husband. Terrence looked up, his tear-stained face twisting in utter confusion. He looked from Julian's briefcase back to my face, his hands still gripping the hem of my coat. "Maya," he stammered, his voice trembling. "Maya, what is going on? Why is your lawyer here? Please tell me you are calling off the collection." I reached down and calmly peeled his fingers off my pristine white coat, stepping back to create a physical barrier between us. "We are not here to reconcile, Terrence," I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, icy register that froze the very blood in his veins. "We are here for the house, here for the—" The words hung in the air, freezing the blood in Terrence's veins. He stared up at me, his hands slowly slipping from the pristine hem of my white crepe coat. The sheer gravity of what I had just said crashed over him, leaving him completely paralyzed on the ruined Persian rug. He did not ask questions. He did not beg any more. He simply collapsed backward, sitting hard on the floor amidst the shattered glass and spilled wine, his mind entirely unable to process this new level of devastation. Julian strode past him without a single downward glance. My lead corporate attorney moved with the measured predatory grace of a man who dealt exclusively in absolute destruction. He was dressed in an immaculate charcoal bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly swept back, his expression entirely devoid of emotion. He walked into the dining room as if he were entering a sterile corporate boardroom, completely unfazed by the screaming, the crying, and the physical carnage that had just ripped this family apart. He did not flinch at the sight of Malik bleeding from the mouth. He did not acknowledge Keisha weeping hysterically in the corner. He did not care about Vivian sobbing into her hands. Julian had one objective, and he executed it with terrifying precision. He walked straight toward the center of the grand mahogany table. With a smooth, practiced motion, Julian lifted his thick, heavy leather briefcase and slammed it down. He deliberately bypassed the empty spaces on the table and set the briefcase directly over the Atlanta General Hospital DNA results. The heavy leather completely smothered the scandalous medical report, visually crushing the family's biological nightmares under the immense, suffocating weight of impending financial ruin. The loud thud of the briefcase hitting the wood snapped Roland out of his catatonic shock. Roland pushed himself up from the head of the table. His chair scraped violently against the floorboards, the harsh sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The patriarch of the family, desperate to reclaim some shred of his shattered authority, puffed out his chest. His face flushed a dark, angry purple as he pointed a shaking finger at Julian. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Roland bellowed, his voice vibrating with a frantic, desperate rage. "You do not just waltz into my home uninvited. This is a private family matter. We are dealing with a crisis. I want you out of my house this exact second. If you do not turn around and walk out that front door right now, I am calling the police and having you arrested for trespassing. Get out of my house." Julian did not even blink. He did not take a step back, nor did he offer Roland the basic courtesy of a defensive response. He simply adjusted his gold wire-rimmed glasses and looked at Roland as if he were a nuisance disrupting a routine audit. "I am here on official corporate business," Julian stated, his tone flat, even and entirely unbothered by Roland's posturing. "And as for your threat regarding local law enforcement, I strongly suggest you reconsider. Having the police present for what is about to transpire will only accelerate your public humiliation. Furthermore, you do not have the legal authority to dictate who enters this property." Roland's jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. He opened his mouth to shout again, ready to unleash a tirade about disrespect and his family legacy. But I stepped forward. I placed myself directly in Roland's line of sight, forcing him to look at me. I needed him to see the woman he had dismissed as a stiff, uncultured outsider for the entirety of my marriage to his son. "Shut your mouth, Roland," I commanded, my voice slicing through the thick tension of the dining room with absolute unyielding authority. "Do not raise your voice at my attorney. He is simply the messenger delivering the consequences of your own incompetence. You love talking about this house, do you not? You love boasting about this sprawling ancestral estate, the crown jewel of your family legacy. You love hosting your lavish Sunday dinners and looking down on everyone from the head of this table as if you are a king ruling over a vast empire. Vivian let out a muffled sob, burying her face deeper into her hands, but Roland stared at me, his chest heaving. His bravado was beginning to fracture, replaced by the exact same creeping dread that had just consumed his youngest son. "Maya, what are you doing?" Roland demanded, his voice dropping an octave, losing its aggressive edge. "What is this about? You have already destroyed Terrence. You have already ruined our family celebration. What more could you possibly want from us?" "I want to finish the conversation we started 10 minutes ago," I replied smoothly, folding my arms across my chest. "We were talking about strong foundations. We were talking about the winter of 2019. You remember that winter, Roland? The year your commercial development firm was bleeding capital so fast you were facing total insolvency. You came to my office in the middle of the night weeping like a child, begging me to fix your ledgers behind Vivian's back so she would not find out you had squandered the family fortune on terrible investments." I paused, letting my eyes sweep over the aunts and uncles who were hanging onto my every word. "I told Vivian earlier that I reorganized your debt." I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I told her I pulled strings and called in favors to save the roof over your head. I told her I was the good, supportive daughter-in-law who kept you off the street. But I left out the specific mechanics of that transaction. I left out exactly how I managed to make your massive, suffocating debt disappear overnight." Roland's face lost whatever color it had left. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles stark white against the dark mahogany. He was beginning to understand. The realization was crawling up his spine, freezing him in place. "I did not just move numbers around on a spreadsheet, Roland," I explained, enunciating every word so that the reality would sink deep into his bones. "You were exactly 4 days away from a bank foreclosure. The bank did not care about your legacy. They did not care about your pride. They wanted their money, and you had absolutely none to give them. Your credit lines were entirely exhausted. Your assets were leveraged to the hilt. You were financially radioactive. No legitimate banking institution in this state was going to touch you or offer you a lifeline. You were completely out of options." Roland swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward Julian's briefcase, then back to my face. "So I did what I do best," I said, taking a slow, measured step toward him. "I assessed the risk, and I acquired the asset. I did not ask the bank for a favor. I did not beg them for a deadline extension. I stepped in through a proxy corporation, a private holding company completely insulated from my personal assets and entirely untraceable to my name." Malik, still clutching his bleeding jaw on the floor, looked up at me in horror. He understood corporate law. He knew exactly what a proxy acquisition meant. "I bought your mortgage, Roland," I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling absolute finality. "I paid off the bank in full. I purchased the debt on this very house, and I have quietly held that debt for the last 5 years while you sat at the head of this table and treated me like I was beneath you. You thought you outsmarted the system. You thought you bounced back from the brink of ruin through your own sheer brilliance. But you never bounced back. You just traded a faceless corporate bank for a much more dangerous creditor." "Me?" Roland shook his head, taking a stumbling step backward. "No," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "That is impossible. I pay my servicer every month. I make the payments." "You pay the servicer, and the servicer routes those payments directly into a blind trust that I control," I corrected him, stripping away his last shred of denial. "And just like Terrence's business loan, your mortgage contract has stipulations. It has clauses. You have been late on your payments 4 times in the last 12 months, Roland. Under the strict terms of the distressed asset acquisition, 3 consecutive late payments trigger an immediate default. I could have seized this property a year ago, but I waited. I waited until the perfect moment to collect." Julian calmly popped the brass latches on his leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the silent room like the cocking of a shotgun. Everyone watched in breathless anticipation as Julian reached inside. The sound of shifting paper made Roland physically flinch. Julian pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. They were the original property deeds, heavily stamped, notarized, and legally binding. They proved the absolute transfer of ownership and the active aggressive lien held by my proxy corporation. Julian placed them on the table, sliding them across the polished mahogany until they rested directly in front of Roland. "Look at them, Roland," I instructed, gesturing toward the papers. "Read the name of the holding company. Read the default notice." Roland stared down at the documents. His eyes scanned the bold, undeniable legal text. His hands shook so violently he could not even pick up the pages. He just stared at the undeniable proof of his total failure. His jaw literally dropped. His breathing stopped. The grand illusion of his power, his wealth, and his untouchable patriarchal status completely evaporated into thin air. He was ruined. I looked around the lavish room. I took in the intricate hand-carved crown molding the sparkling antique chandelier, the sweeping grand staircase visible in the foyer, and the shattered remnants of the china cabinet on the floor. I looked back at Roland, savoring the absolute total destruction of his pride. "You are not the lord of the manor, Roland," I said, my voice echoing with icy, merciless finality. "You are my tenant." Terrence's hands fell limply to his sides, slipping from the hem of my immaculate white coat. He slumped backward, sitting heavily amidst the shattered glass of the china cabinet and the spreading pool of expensive red wine. He did not ask questions. He did not beg any further. The sheer crushing gravity of what I had just said completely paralyzed him, leaving him staring up at me with vacant, uncomprehending eyes. Julian strode past my ex-husband without a single downward glance. My lead corporate attorney moved with the measured, predatory grace of a man who dealt exclusively in absolute destruction. Dressed in an impeccable charcoal bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly swept back, and his expression entirely devoid of emotion, Julian walked into the dining room as if he were entering a sterile corporate boardroom. He was entirely unfazed by the screaming, the crying, and the physical carnage that had just ripped this family apart. He did not flinch at the sight of Malik bleeding from the mouth. He did not acknowledge Keisha weeping hysterically in the corner. He did not care about Vivian sobbing into her hands. Julian had one objective, and he executed it with terrifying precision. He walked straight toward the center of the grand mahogany table. With a smooth, practiced motion, Julian lifted his heavy leather briefcase and slammed it down. He deliberately bypassed the empty spaces on the table and set the briefcase directly over the Atlanta General Hospital DNA results. The thick leather completely smothered the scandalous medical report, visually crushing the family's biological nightmares under the immense, suffocating weight of impending financial ruin. The loud thud of the briefcase hitting the wood snapped Roland out of his catatonic shock. Roland pushed himself up from the head of the table. His chair scraped violently against the floorboards, the harsh sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The patriarch of the family, desperate to reclaim some shred of his shattered authority, puffed out his chest. His face flushed a dark, angry purple as he pointed a shaking finger at Julian. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Roland bellowed, his voice vibrating with a frantic, desperate rage. "You do not just waltz into my home uninvited. This is a private family matter. We are dealing with a crisis. I want you out of my house this exact second. If you do not turn around and walk out that front door right now, I am calling the police and having you arrested for trespassing. Get out of my house." Julian did not even blink. He did not take a step back, nor did he offer Roland the basic courtesy of a defensive response. He simply adjusted his gold wire-rimmed glasses and looked at Roland as if he were a nuisance disrupting a routine audit. "I am here on official corporate business," Julian stated, his tone flat, even, and entirely unbothered by Roland's posturing. "And as for your threat regarding local law enforcement, I strongly suggest you reconsider. Having the police present for what is about to transpire will only accelerate your public humiliation. Furthermore, you do not have the legal authority to dictate who enters this property." Roland's jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched in his cheek. He opened his mouth to shout again, ready to unleash a tirade about disrespect and his family legacy. But I stepped forward. I placed myself directly in Roland's line of sight, forcing him to look at me. I needed him to see the woman he had dismissed as a stiff, uncultured outsider for the entirety of my marriage to his son. "Shut your mouth, Roland!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the thick tension of the dining room with absolute unyielding authority. "Do not raise your voice at my attorney. He is simply the messenger delivering the consequences of your own incompetence. You love talking about this house, do you not? You love boasting about this sprawling ancestral estate, the crown jewel of your family legacy. You love hosting your lavish Sunday dinners and looking down on everyone from the head of this table as if you are a king ruling over a vast empire." Vivian let out a muffled sob, burying her face deeper into her hands, but Roland stared at me, his chest heaving. His bravado was beginning to fracture, replaced by the exact same creeping dread that had just consumed his youngest son. "Maya, what are you doing?" Roland demanded, his voice dropping an octave, losing its aggressive edge. "What is this about? You have already destroyed Terrence. You have already ruined our family celebration. What more could you possibly want from us?" "I want to finish the conversation we started 10 minutes ago," I replied smoothly, folding my arms across my chest. "We were talking about strong foundations. We were talking about the winter of 2019. You remember that winter, Roland? The year your commercial development firm was bleeding capital so fast you were facing total insolvency. You came to my office in the middle of the night, weeping like a child, begging me to fix your ledgers behind Vivian's back so she would not find out you had squandered the family fortune on terrible investments." I paused, letting my eyes sweep over the aunts and uncles who were hanging onto my every word. "I told Vivian earlier that I reorganized your debt." I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I told her I pulled strings and called in favors to save the roof over your head. I told her I was the good, supportive daughter-in-law who kept you off the street. But I left out the specific mechanics of that transaction. I left out exactly how I managed to make your massive, suffocating debt disappear overnight." Roland's face lost whatever color it had left. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles stark white against the dark mahogany. He was beginning to understand. The realization was crawling up his spine, freezing him in place. "I did not just move numbers around on a spreadsheet, Roland," I explained, enunciating every word so that the reality would sink deep into his bones. "You were exactly 4 days away from a bank foreclosure. The bank did not care about your legacy. They did not care about your pride. They wanted their money, and you had absolutely none to give them. Your credit lines were entirely exhausted. Your assets were leveraged to the hilt. You were financially radioactive. No legitimate banking institution in this state was going to touch you or offer you a lifeline. You were completely out of options." Roland swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward Julian's briefcase, then back to my face. "So I did what I do best," I said, taking a slow, measured step toward him. "I assessed the risk, and I acquired the asset. I did not ask the bank for a favor. I did not beg them for a deadline extension. I stepped in through a proxy corporation, a private holding company completely insulated from my personal assets and entirely untraceable to my name." Malik, still clutching his bleeding jaw on the floor, looked up at me in horror. He understood corporate law. He knew exactly what a proxy acquisition meant. "I bought your mortgage, Roland," I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling, absolute finality. "I paid off the bank in full. I purchased the debt on this very house. And I have quietly held that debt for the last 5 years while you sat at the head of this table and treated me like I was beneath you. You thought you outsmarted the system. You thought you bounced back from the brink of ruin through your own sheer brilliance. But you never bounced back. You just traded a faceless corporate bank for a much more dangerous creditor. Me." Roland shook his head, taking a stumbling step backward. "No," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "That is impossible. I pay my servicer every month. I make the payments." "You pay the servicer, and the servicer routes those payments directly into a blind trust that I control." I corrected him, stripping away his last shred of denial. "And just like Terrence's business loan, your mortgage contract has stipulations. It has clauses. You have been late on your payments 4 times in the last 12 months, Roland. Under the strict terms of the distressed asset acquisition, 3 consecutive late payments trigger an immediate default. I could have seized this property a year ago, but I waited. I waited until the perfect moment to collect. Julian calmly popped the brass latches on his leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the silent room like the cocking of a shotgun. Everyone watched in breathless anticipation as Julian reached inside. The sound of shifting paper made Roland physically flinch. Julian pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, watermarked paper. They were the original property deeds, heavily stamped, notarized, and legally binding. They proved the absolute transfer of ownership and the active aggressive lien held by my proxy corporation. Julian placed them on the table, sliding them across the polished mahogany until they rested directly in front of Roland. "Look at them, Roland," I instructed, gesturing toward the papers. "Read the name of the holding company. Read the default notice." Roland stared down at the documents. His eyes scanned the bold, undeniable legal text. His hands shook so violently he could not even pick up the pages. He just stared at the undeniable proof of his total failure. His jaw literally dropped. His breathing stopped. The grand illusion of his power, his wealth, and his untouchable patriarchal status completely evaporated into thin air. He was ruined. I looked around the lavish room. I took in the intricate hand-carved crown, molding the sparkling antique chandelier, the sweeping grand staircase visible in the foyer, and the shattered remnants of the china cabinet on the floor. I looked back at Roland, savoring the absolute total destruction of his pride. "You are not the lord of the manor, Roland," I said, my voice echoing with icy, merciless finality. "You are my tenant." Roland's knees buckled. He sank back into his heavy dining chair, his eyes glazed over his mouth, opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was a broken man, entirely hollowed out by his own incompetence. "But the mortgage is only the foundation of your problems, Roland." I continued, my voice cutting through the thick, oppressive silence of the room. I shifted my gaze away from the ruined patriarch and locked eyes with Vivian. Vivian had stopped crying. She was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch was finally realizing that I had not just planned a divorce. I had engineered a total demolition. "You needed a massive injection of liquid cash 18 months ago, did you not?" "Vivian?" I asked, my voice ringing clearly across the shattered dining room. "Your country club dues were in arrears. The lease on your luxury vehicles was up for renewal, and Roland's development firm was already operating on fumes. You needed a secondary loan just to keep up the appearance of wealth, but you had absolutely no assets left to borrow against. You had drained every account, mortgaged every property, and exhausted every favor." Vivian opened her mouth to deny it, her hands gripping the edge of the table, but Julian simply placed another document on the wood, tapping his manicured index finger against the bold black signature at the bottom of the page. Vivian looked down, and all the blood drained from her face. "So you got creative?" I continued pacing slowly around the perimeter of the room, letting my heels click sharply against the hardwood floor. "You went to a private equity firm, a firm known for predatory lending rates, and you offered them a brand new piece of collateral. You offered them a thriving, highly profitable consulting business." I stopped pacing and looked down at Terrence. My ex-husband was still sitting on the floor amidst the broken glass, his hands resting limply in his lap. He looked up at me, his brow furrowing as the reality of my words slowly began to penetrate his shock. "You used Terrence's consulting firm as the collateral for a secondary high-yield loan," I said, letting the words hang in the air for maximum impact. Terrence snapped his head around to look at his parents. The hollow devastation in his eyes was instantly replaced by a fresh, blinding rage. "You leveraged my business." Terrence choked out, his voice raw and grating. "You took out a secondary loan against my firm without telling me the extent of the risk. You told me it was just a minor bridge loan. You said it was a formality." "We were trying to protect the family estate," Roland shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. We needed the capital to keep the development firm afloat so we could pay your massive salary. It was a calculated risk. It was a fatal risk, I corrected him sharply, pulling the entire room's attention back to me. Because you tied the survival of this entire family to Terrence's ability to keep that consulting firm profitable. You bet your entire legacy on the assumption that Terrence would remain the untouchable, perfect businessman. But Terrence is not untouchable. I looked down at Keisha, who was still cowering against the wall, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her cheap dress. Terrence breached his morality clause, I announced, ensuring every single family member heard the exact mechanics of his downfall. When he moved his pregnant mistress into a luxury condo, he violated the core ethical stipulations of his initial investor funding. And to avoid a massive public lawsuit, he was forced to settle his debt directly with me. I turned to Vivian, offering her a cold, merciless smile. 10 minutes ago, Terrence signed a legally binding asset forfeiture, I explained. He transferred total ownership of his consulting firm to me to cover his $2.5 million penalty. That means the business he used as collateral for your secondary loan no longer belongs to him. It belongs to me. Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Roland clutched his chest, breathing in rapid, shallow bursts. When the collateral backing a high-yield private equity loan changes ownership, the loan immediately defaults, Julian stated, quoting the law with brutal efficiency. The creditors have a legal right to immediately seize all linked assets to satisfy the debt. I reached into Julian's open briefcase and pulled out a thick, legal envelope adorned with a bright red seal. I walked directly over to Vivian. She shrank back in her chair, pressing herself against the heavy oak carving as if she could merge with the furniture and disappear. I dropped the envelope onto her lap. It hit her silk dress with a heavy, definitive thud. "That is your formal notice of foreclosure, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. "I am not just calling in Terrence's debt. I am seizing the collateral. And since I am the proxy owner of the primary mortgage and now the primary creditor holding your defaulted secondary loan, I am taking absolutely everything." Vivian let out a choked, desperate sound, fumbling with the envelope, her manicured fingers tearing at the red seal. She pulled out the legal documents, her eyes scanning the itemized list of seizures. "I am taking this ancestral home." I listed, my voice loud and clear, ringing out like a judge delivering a sentence. "I am taking the remaining assets in Roland's development firm. I am taking the offshore accounts you thought you hid so cleverly. I am taking the custom Mercedes currently parked in the circular driveway. I am taking the antique heirloom furniture sitting in this very room. I have legally, systematically, and permanently stripped this entire family of every single dime you own. You are completely bankrupt." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an entire dynasty crumbling into dust. The mighty, untouchable family, the people who had mocked my background, insulted my ambition, and treated me like disposable trash, had been utterly annihilated. They had nothing. No money, no status, no legacy. Keisha sat frozen against the wall. The gravity of the situation was finally penetrating her thick, opportunistic skull. She looked at Terrence, who was sitting on the floor weeping silently, entirely stripped of his business, his wealth, and his pride. He could not afford the luxury condo he had promised her. He could not afford the lavish lifestyle. He was penniless. Keisha's eyes darted frantically across the room, landing on Malik. Malik was bleeding from the lip, leaning against the far wall. He had been exposed as a cheat and a liar. His position in the family firm was completely worthless because the firm itself was gone. More importantly, Sarah was leaving him. The quiet, unassuming wife he had treated like a doormat possessed the only remaining wealth in the entire room, and she was taking it all back to Savannah. Malik was just as broke as Terrence. The two men Keisha had so carefully manipulated, the two golden brothers she had played against each other to secure her future, were entirely useless. They were zeroed out. They had nothing left to give her. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized Keisha. She scrambled up from the floor, abandoning the scattered baby carriers and the mess of the ruined dinner. She needed a lifeline. She needed a way to survive the wreckage she had helped create. She looked at me, but the sheer coldness in my eyes made her flinch. She knew I would gladly watch her starve. So Keisha turned to the only person left in the room who possessed an ounce of power and a bank account full of millions. She stumbled across the room, her heels slipping on the polished hardwood, and threw herself at Sarah's feet. Sarah looked down at the mistress, her blue eyes completely devoid of sympathy. "Sarah, please?" Keisha sobbed, grabbing the hem of Sarah's sharp black trench coat, mirroring the exact pathetic position Terrence had taken just moments before. "Please, you have to help me. You have money. Your family has trusts. Malik and Terrence are broke. They cannot pay for the medical bills. They cannot pay for the nursery. I have nothing. I gave up my job for this. You have to help provide for the twins." Sarah did not move. She simply stared down at the weeping bartender. "Please," Keisha begged, her voice rising to a hysterical shriek, tears streaming down her face as she gestured wildly toward her swollen stomach. "I know Malik hurt you. I know he lied. But you are a good person. You are a kind person. Do not punish the children for what we did. You have to help me. The babies are innocent." Sarah looked down at the weeping bartender, clutching the hem of her sharp black trench coat. A dry, chilling laugh escaped Sarah's lips. The sound started low in her chest and built into a sharp, piercing echo that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the ruined dining room. It was not the laugh of the timid, quiet woman who had spent years shrinking into the background to accommodate Malik's massive ego. It was the laugh of a woman who had finally been pushed past the point of no return. Sarah shook her leg with a violent snap, dislodging Keisha's trembling hands with utter disgust. Keisha scrambled backward, her eyes wide with terror as she realized her pleas for mercy had fallen on deaf ears. Sarah stepped up to the edge of the shattered mahogany table, her previously meek demeanor completely eradicated by the white-hot fire of betrayal. She looked at Malik, who was bleeding and struggling to stand, and then she looked at Roland and Vivian, the in-laws who had treated her like a convenient disposable bank account. Without a single word, Sarah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the screen with perfectly manicured fingers, engaged the speakerphone function, and held the device up high so the ringing tone would project across the silent room. The phone rang exactly twice before a deep, gravelly, and undeniably authoritative voice answered. "Sarah, sweetheart, is everything all right?" the man asked. Sarah did not hesitate. Her voice was absolute ice, devoid of any hesitation or warmth. "Dad, it is me," Sarah said, staring directly into Roland's horrified, bulging eyes. "Pull all the investments, burn Roland's company to the ground." She pressed the end button. The sharp mechanical beep of the disconnected call echoed through the grand dining room, sealing the family's fate. Sarah slipped the phone back into her pocket and swept her gaze across the devastated, bankrupt family one last time. The immediate aftermath inside the house was pure, unadulterated chaos. Roland clutched his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of gray as he collapsed heavily against the back of his chair. He gasped for air, his lungs refusing to expand as the reality of his erased legacy crushed the very breath from his body. His entire life's work, his reputation, his status, and his ancestral home were officially dust. Vivian writhed on the floor, tearing at her hair, her wails echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a wounded animal. She was screaming into the void, mourning the total loss of her elite social standing and her unearned luxury. Malik finally scrambled to his feet, ignoring the blood dripping from his chin onto his ruined suit. He lunged towards Sarah, holding his hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged her to wait, pleading that he could explain, pleading that they could fix this, crying that she was his entire world. Sarah did not even blink. She did not offer him a single syllable of closure. She turned on her heel, her posture impeccable, and walked straight out the heavy oak front door. She slipped seamlessly into the back of a waiting black town car that had been idling in the circular driveway. The heavy car door slammed shut, and the red taillights disappeared quickly into the night, taking the family's last remaining lifeline with it. Inside the house, the tension exploded into a new violent direction. Terrence turned his absolute unfiltered rage entirely onto Keisha. He screamed at her, his voice hoarse and raw, blaming her for the total destruction of his life, his finances, and his future. He kicked the empty baby carriers across the room, watching them smash against the far wall. He told her she was nothing but a parasite, a manipulator who had ruined two brothers for a payday that did not even exist. Keisha screamed back her tears, turning to furious panic. She realized the wealthy, successful men she had tried to trap were nothing but penniless, leveraged frauds. The lavish future she had schemed to secure was a mirage. I watched the chaos unfold for exactly 30 seconds. I stood perfectly still, observing the violent arguments, the hyperventilating, and the absolute ruin consuming the room. It was a brilliant, tragic symphony of destruction that they had orchestrated entirely by themselves. I simply provided the sheet music. I caught Julian's eye and gave him a single sharp nod. My attorney mirrored the gesture, his face a mask of professional indifference. We quietly packed our briefcases, snapping the brass latches shut in perfect unison. I took the formal, legally binding foreclosure notice and slid it neatly under the base of a half-empty crystal wine glass on the mahogany table. It rested there, a permanent, undeniable promise of the eviction to come. I turned my back on the screaming, the crying, and the absolute ruin. I walked out into the cool Sunday night air, my heels clicking rhythmically down the stone steps of the grand estate. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air of total freedom. I left the burning house behind me, and I did not look back. Fast forward exactly 1 month. The fallout was swift, brutal, and thoroughly absolute. The legal and financial snare I had meticulously set clamped shut around the family with zero room for negotiation or escape. Terrence is currently working a minimum wage retail job, forced to take the grueling graveyard shift stocking shelves at a massive, unforgiving warehouse. He has dark circles under his eyes and blisters on his hands. Every single paycheck he earns is immediately and ruthlessly garnished by my legal team to chip away at the massive, insurmountable debt he owes my holding company. He lives in a cramped, roach-infested motel on the dreary outskirts of the city. He sleeps on a mattress that smells of mildew, staring up at a stained ceiling, entirely stripped of the arrogant entrepreneurial pride that used to define his every waking moment. Malik fared no better. He was served with aggressive, merciless divorce papers the very morning after the disastrous dinner. Sarah's high-powered legal team systematically stripped him of every asset, every joint account, and every shred of dignity he had left. They buried him in relentless litigation, leaving him drowning in legal fees he had no possible way to pay. The brothers, completely destitute, humiliated, and blaming each other for their total ruin, no longer speak. Their bond was severed the moment the money ran out. Keisha is trapped in a cramped, unair-conditioned apartment on the bad side of town with two screaming infants. The sweltering summer heat bakes the small rooms, and the walls are thin enough to hear every siren that passes by. Both Terrence and Malik abandoned her entirely. The men she tried to manipulate, the men she slept with to secure a luxury lifestyle, have absolutely nothing left to give her. She receives no child support because neither brother has an income to garnish. She is completely isolated, forced to face the exhausting, relentless consequences of her greed completely alone. Vivian and Roland were swiftly and publicly evicted from their sprawling ancestral estate. The foreclosure was handled with maximum legal aggression, offering no extensions and no grace periods. The bank seized the luxury cars from the driveway. The antique furniture was auctioned off to settle a fraction of their remaining corporate debts. The former king and queen of their social circle were forced to rent a tiny, dilapidated two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood they used to openly mock. Their social status in the community has been completely and utterly eradicated. They are the absolute pariahs of their church and their elite country clubs, entirely shunned by the wealthy friends who used to drink their expensive wine and laugh at their jokes. They are ghosts of their former selves, hiding their faces when they walk down the street. I am standing on the expansive glass-walled balcony of my new downtown penthouse, the cool night breeze washing over me as I look out over the glittering, endless city skyline. The world stretches out below me, a vast network of lights and opportunities. Julian steps quietly through the sliding glass doors, his presence a comforting reminder of the flawless execution of our plan. He stops beside me and hands me a thick, heavy manila envelope. Inside are the finalized, undisputed deeds to their former estate, along with the liquidated assets of Roland's collapsed development firm. The paperwork is immaculate. The victory is legally bulletproof. I did not just survive their betrayal, I capitalized on it. I turned their arrogance, their infidelity, and their relentless greed into my ultimate financial leverage. I walk over to my crystal decanter, the heavy glass cool under my fingertips. I pour a generous measure of expensive aged bourbon. I walk back to the edge of the balcony and lift the heavy glass, the amber liquid catching the bright city lights. I take a slow, deeply satisfying sip, letting the warmth settle in my chest. I am wealthy. I am unbothered. I am untouchable. And I am undeniably victorious. The most profound lesson we can draw from these journeys is that your inherent worth is never determined by those who refuse to see it, even if they share your blood. Sometimes the people expected to protect you are the ones holding you back. True family is built on mutual respect and unconditional support, not obligation or manipulation. By bravely walking away from toxic expectations and forging your own independent path, you reclaim your power and author your own success. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering tales of resilience and redemption.